The Arctic in winter is not a place built for men. It is a world of endless black sky, of winds that scream like a living thing, of ice sheets that groan and crack as if they're tired of carrying the weight of time itself. Out there, under a ceiling of frozen stars and auroras that ripple like torn curtains, silence isn't silence at all. It's a pressure. It settles in your chest, gnaws at your nerves, and reminds you that you are a stranger in a place older than memory. It was into this world that the crew of the USCGC Resolute, a Coast Guard icebreaker operating under NATO command, found themselves in late January. Their mission was simple, at least on paper. A surge in Arctic storms had pushed sheets of ancient ice further south, threatening a set of shipping lanes. The Resolute was tasked with reconnaissance, charting safe passage for cargo convoys moving between Europe and North America. They had done missions like this before, but what came across their radios that night was unlike anything any of them had ever experienced. The SOS that shouldn't exist. It was just past 0200 hours. The bridge was lit only by the dull glow of radar screens and the ghostly shimmer of the aurora bleeding green light across the horizon. Petty Officer Ramirez was on watch when the static broke. A faint signal, barely audible, bled through the comms. A crackle, a pause, and then a voice. "This is convoy HX229, position 63 degrees north, 32 degrees west. Heavy ice, heavy casualties, Mayday." The transmission cut out in a shriek of white noise. Ramirez froze. He knew that call sign. Everyone who had studied naval history did. Convoy HX229 was one of the most infamous Allied convoys of World War II. It had sailed in March of 1943, carrying vital supplies from New York to Britain. Somewhere near the icy waters off Greenland, it vanished under German U-boat assault. 30 merchant ships left port. Only a handful ever made it across. But here's the thing, that convoy's last recorded position was nowhere near where Ramirez had just heard the coordinates broadcast. And more importantly, HX229 had been lost over 80 years ago. Tension on the bridge. "Captain, you're gonna want to hear this," Ramirez muttered, pulling the headphones from his ears and turning up the speaker. The voice returned. "We are under attack. Repeat, under attack. Enemy subs. Request immediate assistance." Lieutenant Commander Harker, the ship's commanding officer, straightened in his chair. The voice sounded crisp, clear, too clear. It wasn't the garbled, distorted tone of an old recording. It sounded live, present. "Get me a triangulation on that signal," Harker ordered. Within minutes, the radio officer locked it in. The signal was bouncing from somewhere near the edge of the melting ice fields, only a few dozen nautical miles from their current course. "Sir," Ramirez said carefully, "that convoy sank in 1943. The man giving that call, Commander Albright, he's been dead for decades. But that's his voice. I've heard the recordings." The crew exchanged uneasy looks. No one laughed. No one made a joke. Out here you don't mock the strange. You listen. Orders from above. Within the hour, NATO command confirmed what Harker already suspected. No Allied ships were supposed to be anywhere near those coordinates. No Russian vessels, no research ships, no civilian icebreakers, nothing. But the directive came down anyway. Investigate signal, report findings, proceed with caution. Harker folded the printed message and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't like it. He had sailed through these waters for years, and he knew the stories the Inuit fishermen told. The sea keeps what it wants. The ice remembers everything. Still, orders were orders. He gathered his team in the mess hall, a mix of Coast Guard sailors, NATO liaison officers, and a pair of civilian scientists. Dr. Amelia Krauss, a German historian specializing in WY naval records, and Dr. Novak, a geophysicist studying magnetic anomalies in the Arctic. The captain's voice was steady but low. "Ladies and gentlemen, we just picked up a distress call, call sign HX229. The room went silent. One of the younger sailors laughed nervously. "Wait, sir, that convoy's been gone since 1943. "Yes," Harker cut in, "but the signal we intercepted was transmitted on the old 500 kilohertz frequency, and it came from inside the ice field." He let that sink in. "We're ordered to investigate. The first approach. By morning, The Resolute's reinforced bow was crunching through the grey-blue sheets of sea ice. The temperature outside had dropped to nearly -40 with the wind chill. Crew members on deck could see strange shapes locked in the frozen sea, twisted hunks of steel, shredded canvas, wooden crates with German lettering still visible beneath the frost. Chief Petty Officer Malloy leaned over the railing. "This stuff looks new, like it sank yesterday, but that was impossible. Paint should have flaked away, steel should have rusted to nothing, and yet the fragments glistened under the weak polar sun, as if time itself had skipped over them." "Get the ROV in the water," Harker ordered. The small submersible drone dipped beneath the ice. Its camera flickered to life on the monitors. For a long moment, the crew watched nothing but black water and drifting snow-like particles. Then the image cleared, and there it was, the sharp grey outline of a Liberty ship hull, lying sideways under the ice, the letters still visible on the stern. SS William D. Porter. The name was infamous. One of the cursed ships of the Second World War. A vessel that had accidentally fired a live torpedo at President Franklin D. Roosevelt's battleship during an Allied exercise. The ship was said to have sunk in 1945, thousands of miles from here, in the Pacific. So why was it sitting frozen beneath the Arctic ice? Whispers in the static. As the drone circled the wreck, the bridge radio crackled again. "This is SS William D. Porter. Engines failing. Enemy contact imminent. God help us." The voice was frantic but clear, as if the man were standing right outside the ship. The timestamp embedded in the Morse code header read 1943. Dr. Krauss went pale. That convoy wasn't anywhere near the Pacific, and yet here it is, in the Arctic, with no rust, no decay, as if it never left port. The crew stood in silence, the wind howling outside, the aurora flickering overhead like a warning. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The crew of the USCGC Resolute gathered again on the bridge at dawn. The storm had passed, leaving the sea like broken glass, chunks of ice drifting, colliding, groaning like the breath of some sleeping beast. The air outside was so cold it burned the lungs, every breath hanging in the air like smoke. The aurora had faded, but a pale sun sat low on the horizon, throwing long blue shadows across the endless expanse of white. The signal hadn't stopped. Every few minutes, the radio would spit out the same frantic message, like a broken record playing across time. "This is convoy HX229, engines failing, heavy ice, enemy contact, mayday." It was always the same. The exact same cadence, the exact same panic in the voice. Doubt on deck. Petty Officer Ramirez rubbed his temples, exhausted from replaying the signal over and over through the night. "I'm telling you, sir," he said, voice hoarse, "that's Commander James Albright. I've studied the old archives. His voice was recorded in '43, when they thought they were under U-boat attack. This is it, word for word." Lieutenant Commander Harker didn't answer right away. He stood at the window, binoculars in hand, staring at the faint shapes of steel in the ice. The stern of the William D. Porter rose like a tombstone from the frozen sea. Finally, he lowered the glasses. "Signals don't travel for 80 years. They don't keep repeating themselves like this. I don't know what we're dealing with, but we're going to find out." From the back of the room, Dr. Amelia Krauss spoke up. Her voice was steady, but her face betrayed unease. In 1943, convoy HX229 was one of the largest Allied convoys to ever sail. 38 ships left Halifax, Nova Scotia. They were carrying food, fuel, ammunition, enough to keep Britain alive. Somewhere near Greenland, they were ambushed by wolf packs of U-boats. It was one of the worst convoy battles of the war. More than 20 ships were sunk, hundreds of men lost at sea. She paused, looking toward the icy wreckage outside, but the William D. Porter wasn't among them. She was sunk in the Pacific 2 years later. That was what no one on the Resolute could make sense of. How could a ship, lost in 1945 in the warm Pacific waters, be lying frozen in the Arctic as if preserved in ice for a single night? A new directive. By midday, the encrypted satellite comms lit up again. Orders from command, clipped and clinical. Proceed to coordinates. Investigate source of signal. Confirm identity of transmission origin. Report status immediately. Maintain radio silence except for essential updates. The captain read it aloud, folded the printout, and slid it into his pocket. Then he turned to the crew. "You heard it. We're going in." No one cheered. The Arctic didn't reward bravado. The men and women on this ship had seen what the ice could do. They'd pulled bodies from frozen wrecks, seen whole trawlers split apart like kindling. But this was different. They weren't just steaming into dangerous seas. They were steaming into history. The debate. That evening in the cramped mess hall, the officers sat around a steel table littered with maps, thermos lids, and half-eaten rations. The drone's footage of the William D. Porter played on a loop on the monitor in the corner. Every time the camera swept across the hull, every time the letters William D. Porter slid into view, the room seemed to grow colder. Lieutenant Mason, a young British liaison officer, leaned back and crossed his arms. "Maybe it's a Soviet-era fake," he said. The Russians experimented with mock-up convoys, built replicas to confuse Allied patrols. This could be one of those. Dr. Krauss shook her head. "No. Look at the steelwork. Look at the rivets. This ship is authentic, and the paint, it hasn't aged. A Soviet replica would have rusted decades ago." Chief Malloy slammed his mug on the table. "Then what the hell are we saying? That ship's been sitting under the ice since Roosevelt's time, and somehow still looks brand new." "Not new," said Dr. Novak, the geophysicist. "Preserved, suspended." The room went still. Novak adjusted his glasses, pulling up another screen full of readouts. "The geomagnetic field here is unstable. Look, fluctuations off the charts. Radio waves can bend, loop back, even echo across decades under the right conditions. The ice acts like a lens. It's possible, unlikely, but possible, that we're hearing a transmission from the past." Ramirez swallowed. "Then why did the ship move? Last night, we tracked it 15 nautical miles away. Now look, it's right beneath us." No one had an answer. Night watch. That night, the air was sharper, colder. The ship's searchlights swept across ridges of blue-white ice. Frost crackled across every metal railing. Seaman Ellis was on deck watch, shoulders hunched against the wind. He pulled his parka tight and rubbed his hands together. The world was silent until his radio hissed again. But this time it wasn't the SOS. It was a voice, calm, confident, male. "Convoy HX229, this is William D. Porter. Engines holding steady. Proceeding north by east. Rendezvous in 20 minutes. Ellis froze. He knew enough about military comms to understand what he'd just heard. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a radio check. Routine, normal, as if two well-to-do ships were still coordinating their positions in the middle of the 21st century. He looked out across the ice, heart hammering, and in the far distance, where the aurora shimmered faintly above the horizon, he thought he saw a pinprick of light. A lantern. No, it moved too steadily. A running light. The dull glow of a ship making way through black water. But there was no open water out there, only ice. Ellis swallowed hard, his breath fogging up his goggles. He tapped the comms. "Bridge, you're gonna want to see this." The historian's warning. Back inside, Dr. Krauss studied the transmission logs. Her brow furrowed deeper with every passing second. "This isn't just an echo," she said. "The call sign, the phrasing, the voice, it's identical, yes. But look at this." She pointed to the metadata the technicians had pulled from the signal. "These are real-time corrections. You see? The pauses, the repeats, the way he rekeys the Morse. That's not a recording. That's a live operator, but one who should have died in 1943. Someone muttered a curse under their breath. Krauss lowered her voice. "In Nazi archives, there are references to experiments conducted in the Arctic, projects to manipulate time itself. The Reich believed if they could suspend entire fleets in a temporal bubble, they could unleash them decades later, when the world was weak. The Allies dismissed it as superstition." She turned to the captain. "But what if they succeeded, even partially?" Harker's jaw tightened. He looked again toward the radar screen. The strange contact, whatever it was, had shifted, inch by inch. The ghostly mass beneath the ice was moving, and the radio crackled again. "Porter to convoy lead, standing by, all hands ready at stations." The morning after the second broadcast was colder still. The thermometer outside the Resolute steel bulkhead read -43. The kind of cold that clawed through the thickest parka, that gnawed at the bones and made even the simplest task a punishment. The Arctic wasn't just hostile, it was actively cruel, as though the environment itself resented human intrusion. On the bridge, the radar screen glowed faintly, a pale green circle smeared with static. Every sweep returned the same anomaly, a mass beneath the ice, moving too slowly to be a whale, too deliberately to be drift ice. It pulsed on the screen like a heartbeat. Chief Malloy leaned forward, scratching frost from the glass with a gloved thumb. "Sir, it's heading northeast. Not drifting, it's navigating." Captain Harker didn't answer right away. He stood with his arms folded, his breath steaming in the cold. He hated to admit it, but Malloy was right. Icebergs drift. Submarines dive. This thing, whatever it was sailing into the ice. By midday, the Resolute was grinding deeper into the floes. Her reinforced bow slammed into slabs of ice, shattering them with a thunderous crack. Each impact echoed through the hull, rattling bunk beds and sending coffee sloshing across mess trays. Below deck, Dr. Novak sat hunched over his bank of instruments, their needles twitching erratically. "Magnetics are off the charts again," he muttered, jotting down notes. "It's like a storm underground. Something beneath us is bending the field lines. I can't even calibrate the compass properly." Lieutenant Mason, ever the skeptic, crossed his arms. "Or maybe it's just a solar flare. We're in the damn Arctic, Novak. Compasses misbehave here all the time." Novak didn't even look up. "Solar flares don't stay locked to one coordinate. This is localized. It's deliberate." Up on deck, a small team prepared the ROV, a squat, yellow machine with thrusters and a mounted camera. Petty Officer Ramirez guided it into the black water through a hole cut in the ice. The feed flickered onto the monitors. For long minutes there was nothing but darkness, snow-like particles, and the faint outlines of ice walls. Then the shape emerged again, a hull, the William D. Porter. The letters were sharp and unweathered, white paint gleaming as if the ship had rolled out of the Brooklyn Navy Yard yesterday. The ROV's light swept across a gun mount. The barrel was clean, not corroded. A ragged American flag still clung to a pole, its fabric stiff but intact. The room was silent. "Jesus," someone whispered. Dr. Krauss leaned forward, her voice tight. "This ship sank in 1945, in the Pacific. I've studied every report, every photograph. There's no record, none that she ever came north." The floating helmet. The ROV continued its slow orbit. As the camera swung wide, something drifted into view. A helmet, a steel pot, the kind worn by American sailors in DESUNU. But this helmet wasn't rusted. It gleamed. The straps looked supple, like they'd been oiled yesterday. And worse, far worse, inside the helmet was a smear of blood. Bright, vivid, fresh. Seaman Ellis swallowed hard. That blood can't be from 1945. No one answered him. The only sound was the groan of the ice and the faint hiss of static from the radio. Then the radio crackled again. "This is convoy HX229. Position compromised. Repeat, position compromised. Enemy closing fast." The bridge crew looked at one another. The voice was louder now, clearer, as though the source was rising from the depths. Debate turns to fear. Back in the mess, the arguments flared again. Mason slammed his fist on the table. "It's a goddamn prank. Some Russian sub with a tape deck and too much vodka. Do you hear yourself?" Dr. Krauss shot back. "You think the Russians built a time machine out of a gramophone? That ship is real. That voice is real. And whatever is transmitting from below is operating as if it never left 1943. Novak flipped through his notebook, lines of jagged readings filling the pages. "These anomalies, they match what we see during magnetic reconnection events. But those happen in the upper atmosphere, not under the sea. Unless," he trailed off. "Unless what?" Harker pressed. "Unless something down there is generating its own field. Something not natural. Orders to board." By evening, the orders from command changed. The text was short, but its weight pressed heavy on every chest. "Deploy a boarding party. Investigate the vessel. Retrieve any records." Harker read it twice, his jaw tight. "They want boots on that ship. Tonight." There was no argument this time, just silence. Because deep down, every man and woman aboard the Resolute knew that if they didn't go, someone else would. And in these seas, hesitation could be as deadly as the cold. Preparing the team. The boarding party assembled in the hangar bay as the icebreaker's engines ground against the floes. 10 men and women. Ron Lieutenant Mason, still skeptical but determined not to show fear. Petty Officer Ramirez, clutching his rifle too tightly. Sergeant Calloway, a U.S. Army Ranger attached for joint Arctic operations. Dr. Krauss, insisting she had to see the ship's logbooks with her own eyes. Dr. Novak, against orders but unwilling to let anyone else near his instruments without him. 5 more sailors, all hand-picked for their experience on the ice. They checked weapons, tightened harnesses, and clipped carabiners to the safety lines. Each carried a headlamp, climbing gear, and emergency rations. "Remember," Harker said, his voice echoing in the steel hangar, "you're there to investigate and retrieve, not to play hero. If anything feels wrong, and I mean anything, you get the hell out. Am I clear?" A chorus of "Yes, sir." The captain met Mason's eyes. "You have command." Mason nodded stiffly. The frozen graveyard. The cold hit them like a hammer. The wind screamed across the flat white world, carrying with it flecks of frost that stung their faces. They trudged across the groaning ice toward the looming silhouette of the William D. Porter. Up close, the ship was even more impossible. The hull was intact, the deck guns in place, the bridge windows unbroken. The paint looked decades old, but not rusted, not decayed. Dr. Kraus reached out and brushed her gloved hand across the steel. A flake of ice fell away, revealing bright gray metal beneath. "This is impossible," she whispered. 80 years under salt water should have turned this into a skeleton of rust, but it's preserved. Sergeant Calloway raised his rifle, scanning the shadows. "Preserved or not, I don't like it. Ships don't just walk themselves under ice." As if in answer, a sound echoed from the ship's deck, a hollow clang like a footstep on steel. Then another. The boarding party froze. The sound came again, slower this time, deliberate. The shadow on the deck. Through the blowing snow, Ramirez caught it first. A figure, moving along the rail. Tall, too tall, shoulders hunched. The outline flickered against the Aurora's ghostly light. "Sir," Ramirez whispered, "there's someone up there." Mason lifted his night vision scope. His breath caught. The figure wore a helmet, a long, heavy coat, the silhouette of a rifle slung across its back. It moved stiffly, but with purpose. "That's a sailor," he whispered. "That's a U.S. sailor." "But look," Kraus said sharply, "he's frozen." And she was right. Even through the snow they could see it, a sheen of ice clinging to the man's uniform. His skin pale, his movements jerky, unnatural. He turned his head slowly, and for the first time they saw his face, eyes open, glassy, pupils clouded with frost. The soldier wasn't alive, and yet he was moving. The debris field. Before anyone could speak, a shout went up from one of the sailors at the rear. "Sir, over here!" They hurried across the ice. Scattered across the snow were pieces of gear, rifles, rucksacks, helmets, all of them marked with U.S. Navy stencils. None of them showed the corrosion or rot you'd expect after decades under ice. One canteen still had water sloshing inside. Calloway bent down and picked up a blood-stained dog tag. He wiped it clean with his glove. "Name's Miller, Radioman 3rd Class. He went down with HX-229. I read his file in prep." The wind rose, carrying a faint sound across the ice. At first it was just static. Then, like a voice coming through an old phonograph, they heard it. Miller reporting, "Convoy under fire. We can't hold. They're coming through the ice." The men froze, their breath white in the air. Ramirez's hands shook on his rifle. "Sir, that voice, it's the same name on the dog tag." And then, as if in answer, the figure on the deck raised its frozen hand. Not in greeting, in warning. The boarding party clambered up the icy side of the William D. Porter, their crampons scraping metal, their breath rising in white clouds that instantly crystallized in the night air. The rope lines creaked under the strain, every groan of steel echoing across the frozen wastes. The Aurora shimmered above them, its green curtains rippling as though the sky itself were alive, watching. Lieutenant Mason was the first to crest the railing. His boots crunched against the deck, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. He raised his rifle and swept his night vision scope across the surface. Snow clung to the deck like a burial shroud, but beneath it he could see details. Wooden crates stacked neatly, ropes frozen stiff in place, an old anti-aircraft gun standing tall as if waiting for a crew to man it. And then he saw him, the sailor, the same figure Ramirez had glimpsed earlier. He stood near the bow, back turned to them, helmet rim dusted white with ice crystals. His uniform was unmistakably American Navy issue from the 1940s, though the fabric looked strangely intact, as if time itself had refused to touch it. "Identify yourself," Mason barked, his voice sharp against the wind. The figure didn't turn. Instead, his arm twitched, and then, stiffly, he lifted it and pointed, not at them but out across the ice field toward the dark horizon. Ramirez muttered, "That's not right, sir. That's not right at all. A ship out of time." Dr. Kraus scrambled onto the deck, her boots slipping on the slick metal. Her eyes widened as she took in the ship's condition. "This isn't a wreck," she whispered. "This is—" Novak joined her, running a gloved hand across the steel plating. "The metal's magnetic field is wrong. It's like the atoms are locked in place. This ship shouldn't be here. It shouldn't even exist here." One of the sailors, Jensen, knelt by a crate. He brushed away frost and squinted at the black stenciled letters, U.S. Army Rations, 1943. The crate looked as if it had just been offloaded from a supply depot. He pried the lid open with his knife. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, were tins of meat and biscuits. He picked one up, shook it and frowned. Still sealed, still fresh. Kraus took the tin, examining the faded label. "This is impossible. These rations would have rotted decades ago. Yet look, the seal hasn't even corroded. Maybe it's some kind of experiment," Mason muttered, scanning the silent deck. "Maybe the Navy tested cryogenics, preservation, on an entire ship." Kraus whispered. "With 300 men aboard, the frozen men." They moved cautiously toward the bow. The figure was gone. Only footprints in the snow remained, trailing off toward the hatch that led below deck. "Shall we follow?" Calloway asked, rifle ready. Mason hesitated, then nodded. "Two at a time. Stay sharp." They descended into the interior of the ship. The air inside was worse than the freezing wind outside. Thick, heavy, stinking faintly of rust, and something far more rotten. Their headlamps cut through the blackness, revealing hallways lined with peeling paint and frozen pipes that glittered like crystal veins. Then Ramirez's light caught a face. The sailor was slumped against the wall, helmet tipped forward. His skin was white, not with frostbite, but with something deeper, like the very blood had been drained away. His eyes were open, staring, clouded with frost. His lips were cracked, but as the team approached, they moved. "Convoy, under attack." The whisper was so faint, they almost convinced themselves it was just the wind. Almost. Then the sailor's jaw twitched. A sound, half breath, half static, escaped his throat. He didn't blink. He didn't move. But the voice continued, repeating the same desperate message they'd heard on the radio. Kraus gasped and clutched her notebook to her chest. "Mein Gott, he's not alive, and yet he speaks." Calloway raised his rifle, knuckles white. "Permission to—" "Stand down," Mason snapped. His own voice was shaking. "He's not attacking." They moved past the sailor, deeper into the ship, and that was when they realized he wasn't alone. A corridor of echoes. Every few feet, their lights fell on another figure. Men frozen in place, some seated at tables, some slumped in hammocks, some collapsed in the middle of the corridor, as if they'd fallen mid-stride. All of them preserved, skin pale, eyes clouded, uniforms still crisp. But it wasn't just their appearance, it was the sound. Each man whispered, not groaned, not moaned, whispered, words that didn't belong in this time. "Portside hit, fire in the engine room, enemy subs, torpedoes incoming, hold the line, for the convoy." The whispers overlapped, layered like echoes bouncing in a cave. Dr. Kraus's hands trembled as she scribbled furiously. "This is it," she whispered. "This is the convoy. But they're trapped in some kind of temporal loop. They're reliving the night they died, over and over." Novak's instruments shrieked in protest, the needle slamming against the glass. "The magnetic field here it's like a whirlpool. If this continues, it could tear more than just signals out of time. It could tear us apart." The captain's dilemma. Back on the Resolute, Captain Harker listened to the transmissions coming from his boarding party. At first it was clear. Mason's voice giving reports, Ramirez calling out positions, then static, then whispers. "They're everywhere. Can't tell if they're alive. Dog tags, blood fresh." Harker gripped the console. "Team 1, confirm status. Over." Static. Then Mason's voice, faint, almost drowned in a sea of overlapping whispers. "Captain, we found them. The crew. They're still here, still alive, but not." Then another voice cut in, a voice that was not Mason's, a deep, war-weary growl, full of frost and echo. "Convoy HX229, hold the line." The radio went dead. Harker stared at the comms officer. That wasn't Mason. No, sir, Ramirez whispered. That was Commander Albright, a man who had died in 1943. The frozen chapel. Deep inside the porter, the boarding team stumbled into what had once been the ship's mess hall. The tables were lined with frozen bodies, their hands clasped in prayer. In the center of the room stood a chaplain, his Bible frozen open in his hands. His lips moved silently, but when the team drew closer, the static returned. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, his voice rasped through the comms, though his throat was a block of ice. Krause's eyes filled with tears. They've been here praying for 80 years. Calloway shook his head. No, no way. This is some kind of recording. The chaplain's eyes rolled upward. Frost cracked across his cheeks. His voice rose louder now, shaking the walls. I shall fear no evil. The lights in the mess hall flickered. The plice in the mess hall flickered. The ROV feed on the monitor, back aboard the Resolute, glitched, static tearing across the screen. And then, for the first time, the whispers changed. They are coming, not from below, not from above, but through. The boarding team froze. Through what? Mason whispered. The chaplain's head jerked violently to the side. His eyes stared past them, into the black corridor behind. The sound of boots echoed in the dark. Heavy, deliberate, coming closer. The sound of boots on steel echoed from the corridor beyond the mess hall. Heavy, deliberate steps. Not the hurried scuffle of a frightened sailor, not the rhythmic march of a modern patrol. No, this was different. Each impact reverberated as though the ship itself remembered the tread. The boarding party froze in place. Mason raised a fist for silence, his breath fogging in the frigid air. The glow of their headlamps caught the faces of the frozen crew. Rows of pale, ice-glazed men locked in prayer, lips frozen mid-word. Their whispers still crawled across the comms in a nightmarish chorus. Torpedoes incoming, hold fast. God have mercy. And then the sound came again. Closer now. The team turned as one, rifles snapping up toward the open doorway. A figure in the corridor. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was not one of the American sailors. The man was tall, too tall, his shoulders brushing the pipes along the ceiling. His uniform was not navy blue but grey wool, the long coat buttoned tight against the cold. A faded swastika armband clung to one sleeve, its crimson still shockingly vibrant despite the decades. His face was a mask of frostbite, skin stretched tight and pale, lips split and blackened. His eyes were the worst of all, not blind and clouded like the American sailors, but glowing faintly like two burning coals in a furnace. The team didn't breathe. Dr. Krause whispered, almost inaudibly, a Kriegsmarine officer from a U-boat. The figure's head tilted, jerking unnaturally to one side, as though his neck had frozen mid-motion. He opened his mouth, and the static returned to their comms. File the torpedoes away, Sie kommen. The words were German, broken, choked, repeating like a record stuck in its groove. The enemy that never died. Jesus Christ, Ramirez muttered, taking a step back. His finger tightened on the trigger. Hold your fire, Mason hissed, though every nerve screamed at him to shoot. The figure didn't advance. Instead, it stopped in the middle of the corridor and raised a trembling hand to its temple, like a man tipping his cap. Frost cracked across his face. His lips curled into a grotesque smile. And then they saw the others, more figures emerging from the darkness, sailors in frozen uniforms, German crewmen with rusted pistols still strapped to their belts. They shuffled into the light, each of them whispering. The words overlapped, English and German, pleas and orders, all repeating endlessly. Dr. Novak's instruments shrieked louder, warning of a spike in magnetic flux. "We shouldn't be here," he said, his voice cracking. "This ship, it's not just preserved, it's haunted by time itself." The first attack, one of the frozen figures twitched violently. It wasn't like the others. This one moved with sudden speed, lunging forward. It was a German sailor, his body wrapped in ice, uniform stiff with frost. But when he moved, it was like watching a puppet pulled by invisible strings. He let out a guttural scream that echoed through the comms, half human, half static. "Engage," Mason barked. Gunfire tore through the corridor, deafening in the enclosed space. Bullets shattered ice from the figure's body, chunks spraying across the floor. But the sailor didn't fall. He kept moving forward, jerking unnaturally, his arms reaching. Calloway stepped forward and slammed the butt of his rifle into the figure's chest. The frozen sailor stumbled back, cracking loudly as if his bones were made of brittle glass. For a moment, the whispers stopped. Then, all at once, the entire corridor of frozen men turned their heads, every single one of them. Dozens of glassy, frost-clouded eyes stared directly at the boarding party, and they all whispered the same phrase, in unison, in perfect clarity: "You don't belong here. The enemy below. The enemy below." Panic surged. Ramirez fired another burst, his rounds sparking off the frozen steel walls. Jensen cursed, trying to reload with trembling hands. Dr. Kraus was pressed against the wall, her notebook clutched to her chest like a shield, her lips moving in a silent prayer. The figures didn't flinch. They began to move together, step by step, their boots striking the floor in that same impossible rhythm. Mason shouted into his radio, "Resolute, this is Team 1. We have multiple hostiles on board. Repeat, multiple." Static swallowed his words. Back on the Resolute, Captain Harker heard nothing but a wave of overlapping voices. Men shouting in English and German, layered with the desperate whispers they'd been hearing all night. "Torpedoes in the water. They're coming through the ice. Hold the line." Then faintly, Mason's voice bled through. "They're not alive. They're not." The transmission cut out. The frozen enemy revealed. Inside the ship, the boarding party retreated toward the open hatch. But before they could reach it, the frozen Kriegsmarine officer stepped fully into the light. Now they could see him clearly. His face was a mask of ice and rot, but his uniform was immaculate. His boots were polished, his belt buckle gleamed with the Nazi eagle. In his hand he carried a Luger pistol, frost clinging to the metal. He raised the weapon slowly, deliberately. The crew braced for a shot, but instead of firing, he pressed the barrel against his own temple. His voice filled the corridor, not from his mouth, but from the ship itself. "See common, fire, torpedoes away." And then he pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed, deafening, but no bullet struck. The man's head jerked back, ice cracking, yet he remained standing. His eyes glowed brighter, his smile widened. Dr. Novak whispered, it's not him anymore. It's something else, something using them." The officer lowered the pistol and took another step forward, and then the deck itself groaned, louder than ever before, as if the ship was waking up. The wind outside howled like a living creature, shaking the icebreaker's hull as though it were a child's toy. On the deck of the William D. Porter, the boarding team braced against the steel walls of the corridor, rifles raised, breaths coming out in ragged icy plumes. The frozen Kriegsmarine officer still stood before them, his shattered skull glistening like crystal in the beam of their headlamps. And yet he hadn't fallen. He couldn't fall. The whispers were no longer scattered fragments. They were layered chants, voices from two different languages, merging into something that was not quite German, not quite English. It was like listening to the sea itself speak through human throats. "They are here. They are here. The storm, the storm." Lieutenant Mason's throat felt tight. He wanted to scream at the apparition, to demand answers, but his military instincts overrode his fear. "Back it up. We're leaving." The team began to retreat toward the hatch, but the ship had other plans. The ship awakens. The corridor shifted beneath their boots. The groaning steel wasn't just noise anymore. It was movement. The floor vibrated, the rivets along the bulkhead rattling like teeth in a skull. From somewhere deep below, a metallic clang rang out, followed by the unmistakable sound of water rushing in. "Sir, the hull's moving," Ramirez shouted. "No kidding," Mason growled, gripping the ladder that led up to the deck. "Move, move." But as they climbed, the ship's interior lights flickered on. Pale yellow bulbs, dark since 1943, buzzed with sudden electricity. The narrow corridor was washed in a sickly glow, and in that light, the frozen sailors appeared to stir. One by one their heads lifted, frost cracked and flaked from their faces, their mouths moved in unison, and for the first time the sound came not from the comms, but from their own throats. "Enemy in the water, torpedoes inbound, hold the line." The mess hall echoed with the endless call of men who had died 8 decades earlier, repeating orders to ghosts. The descent instead of escape. Mason reached the hatch and shoved at the frozen wheel. It wouldn't budge. Ice had welded it shut from the outside. "Damn it," he cursed. "We're sealed in. Other way." Calloway barked, pointing down the corridor. "There's another stairwell forward." Mason hesitated. Every instinct told him not to go deeper, but the sound of boots echoing toward them left no choice. "All right, forward. Stay sharp." They pushed into the bowels of the ship, past rows of compartments that looked as if their occupants had simply frozen mid-breath. A cook stood at a stove, ladle in hand, soup in the pot below, still faintly steaming. A radio operator hunched over his set, fingers poised above the dials, whispering lines of static-filled code. The deeper they went, the louder the whispers became. It was as if the ship itself was speaking, through every frozen throat, through every rusted pipe. Novak's instruments wailed with a constant high-pitched screech. He slapped the panel. "Magnetics are spiking off the scale. We're right at the center." "The center of what?" Ramirez asked. Novak's pale eyes darted to him. "The storm, the distortion, the reason this ship is here at all. The engine room." They reached a bulkhead door marked engine room. The paint was flaking, but the lettering was still clear. Mason hesitated before gripping the wheel and forcing it open. The door groaned, ice cracking like bone snapping. What lay beyond stopped them in their tracks. The engine room was alive. The massive turbines thrummed with power, their pistons moving as though the ship had never sunk. Steam hissed from valves. Pipes rattled, dripping water that froze mid-drip, suspended in the air like glass icicles. And in the center of the room stood a circle of men, sailors and German submariners, their bodies locked in frost, their eyes glowing faintly. They faced inward, surrounding something that pulsed with a dull blue-green light. It wasn't machinery. It wasn't anything human hands had built. It was a sphere, about 2 meters across, its surface shifting like liquid metal, glowing faintly with a sickly luminescence. Tendrils of light extended from it, wrapping around the frozen men like puppet strings. Each time the sphere pulsed, their mouths moved in unison, whispering words that didn't belong to any language the team recognized. The sound poured into their radios, bypassing every channel, every frequency. Dr. Krause's face was pale. "It's not just a machine. It's a transmitter, a beacon." Novak shook his head. "No, not a transmitter, a receiver. It's pulling something through. The vision." Suddenly the lights died. Total darkness, only their headlamps illuminated the circle of frozen men. Then the sphere flared. Blue-green light erupted across the walls, shimmering like water. The metal around them rippled. For a moment, Mason thought the walls of the ship weren't steel at all, but ice, transparent, endless, showing something on the other side. Shapes moved within that light, shadows, massive and alien, long arms, too many joints, faces that were not human, staring back at them with curiosity or hunger. Private Collins dropped his rifle. Oh God, they're looking at us." The whispers rose into a scream. English, German, something older. The frozen sailors and submariners began to convulse, their bodies snapping and jerking as the tendrils of light pulled tighter, and then one of them broke free. "The enemy lives." It was a U-boat sailor, his face half gone, his eyes burning with cold fire. He staggered toward the team, dragging a chain behind him. When Ramirez fired, the bullets passed through his chest like smoke. The figure didn't even slow down. Mason barked, "Fall back! Form up! Form up!" But the corridor behind them was no longer metal. The walls shimmered with that same liquid light, the rivets bending and twisting into impossible shapes. They weren't in the porter anymore. They were between. Dr. Novak's voice was shrill now. "It's a dimensional bleed. The battle, it's still happening on the other side. We're standing in the crossfire." As if to prove his words, the walls flashed again. For a brief stomach-twisting instant, they weren't on a silent ship under the Arctic at all. They were on a burning deck, the night sky lit with tracer fire. Explosions thundered in the distance, and the screams of dying men tore through the air. Then, just as suddenly, they were back in the frozen engine room, but the figures were moving closer. A terrible realization. Krause's voice was trembling as she pointed to the glowing sphere. "It's not just preserving them, it's keeping them alive, caught between the moment of death and the present. That's why the blood was fresh. That's why the rations haven't spoiled. Time doesn't move here the way it does above." Mason swallowed hard. His mind raced. "So what happens to us if we stay here too long?" Novak looked at him, face pale beneath the frost clinging to his beard. "We become part of it." The whispers swelled, pressing against their eardrums, vibrating in their skulls. Words that weren't meant for human tongues filled the air. "The storm is the door. The sea remembers. The convoy must sail forever." And as the frozen enemy raised their weapons, Mason realized they weren't just looking at the past.
The past was reaching for them.
The engine room was no longer just an engine room. The circle of frozen men stood rigid around the glowing sphere, their lips moving in unison, whispering words that echoed inside the soldiers' skulls as much as in the air. The blue-green light had grown brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat, casting long shadows across the machinery. Mason could feel the vibrations in his teeth. The hum was so deep it rattled through his bones, making his stomach churn. He steadied himself against the wall, forcing his breathing into rhythm. Eyes open. Don't let them flank us. But flank meant nothing here anymore. The ship itself seemed to twist with every pulse of light. Bulkheads bent, corridors stretched impossibly far before snapping back like rubber bands. For a moment Mason could swear he saw an entire ocean spilling into the room, waves crashing through the floor and ceiling, yet leaving no water behind. Ramirez spat onto the floor. The spit froze instantly before it hit the steel deck. "Sir, I don't like this. It's like we're standing on the edge of something that ain't supposed to exist." Kraus, her face pale but her eyes alight with a strange fascination, stepped closer to the sphere. "It's a rift," she whispered, "a tear in time and space. This is what they were guarding. This is what they were trying to protect or contain." The echoes intensify. The whispers changed pitch. Instead of fading in and out, they rose like a chant, a ritual call. "Keep the passage open. The convoy must sail. The war never ends." The German officer raised his cracked, frost-bitten hand. His glowing eyes locked on Mason, and this time the words came out in English, loud and clear. "You are part of the convoy now." Mason's blood went cold. He shook his head violently, raising his rifle. "We're not part of anything. We're getting out of here." But even as he said it, he realized his boots were sinking slightly into the deck, as though the steel beneath them was turning soft, pliable, absorbing them into the ship. "Sir," Jensen shouted, trying to pull his foot free, "it's sucking us in." The sphere pulsed again, brighter, and for a split second, the engine room was gone. The shift. They were no longer in a frozen tomb. The air was hot, stifling, filled with the acrid sting of smoke. The turbines roared, fully alive. Men ran screaming past them, shouting orders in English and German. The ship was no longer trapped in ice. It was under attack. Through the bulkhead porthole, Mason saw the black ocean, lit with tracer fire and explosions. A convoy of ships stretched across the waves, some already aflame. A U-boat's conning tower cut through the water, and a torpedo streaked toward the porter. The boarding team was caught in the middle of a battle that had already been fought, yet somehow was happening again. Bullets slammed into the bulkhead beside them. One of the frozen sailors, suddenly fluid with life, screamed as he returned fire with a mounted machine gun. But when Mason looked again, the sailor was frozen in place, the ice back on his face, his mouth locked mid-shout. "Sir," Calloway's voice was panicked, "we're jumping in and out of time. 1 second it's 1943, the next it's this. Whatever the hell this is." Novak was staring at the sphere, his instruments fried, sparks popping from the device. "It's a breach," he said hoarsely, "not just to the past, to somewhere else. That's what they were fighting, not just each other. Something else came through, the shadow beyond." The blue-green light swelled to a blinding intensity, and for a moment, Mason shielded his eyes. When his vision cleared, he saw it. Something enormous was pushing against the barrier of the sphere, a shape, shifting and writhing, a hand, if it could be called that, pressed outward, fingers too long, bending in unnatural ways, each tipped with claws of jagged ice. The frozen sailors screamed as one. "Hold the line! Hold the line! They must not pass!" The German officer raised his pistol again, pointing it not at the team but at the glowing sphere. His voice was ragged, desperate. "Feuer! Feuer!" Mason's heart hammered. He understood now. The Americans and Germans hadn't been fighting each other. They had been fighting together against whatever was trying to come through, and the sphere, the rift, was still open. The choice. Mason turned to Novak. "Can we shut it down?" Novak's hands shook as he examined the sparking instruments. "Maybe, but it's feeding on energy on the ship itself. If I overload the turbines, it could collapse, but we'd go down with it." "Sir," Calloway said, panic in his eyes, We can't stay here. We'll get stuck in this loop. You heard her. We'll become part of it." Krause's voice was strangely calm. "If this breach remains open, it will not just trap this ship. It could spread. The Arctic itself could tear apart. The things beyond the veil, they are waiting." Mason clenched his jaw. The choice was clear but impossible. Either they destroyed the sphere and risked being consumed with the ship, or they tried to escape, risking unleashing something far worse upon the world. He raised his radio again, though static still hissed in his ear. "Resolute, if you can hear me, we've got a situation. This ship, it's a gate. It's holding something back. We might not make it out." No response, only whispers. "Join us. The convoy sails forever." The deck groaned again, and Mason realized the ship was sinking, pulling them not into the sea, but into the light of the rift. A final glimpse. The officer stepped forward, his glowing eyes locked on Mason. He extended the Luger toward him, handle first, as though offering it. Mason stared at it, then at the sphere. He understood the gesture. "Sir, don't," Ramirez begged. "We can still get out." Mason gripped the pistol. It was ice cold, heavier than it should have been. He raised it, aiming at the sphere. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, shaking the walls, rattling their bones. "The war never ends. The storm is the door. They are coming." Mason squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked like thunder. The sphere shattered. The collapse. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the world fell apart. The engine room dissolved into liquid light. The turbines melted into shadow. The frozen sailors screamed as their bodies shattered into shards of ice and bone. The officer with the glowing eyes dissolved into ash, his smile the last thing to vanish. The ship groaned, its metal folding inward like paper, sucked toward the collapsing rift. The boarding team clung to whatever they could, but the pull was immense, dragging them toward the sphere's imploding heart. Mason shouted over the roar, "Hold on, don't let go." The light consumed everything. The last thing Mason saw was the endless ocean, not frozen, not calm, but boiling, filled with shapes too vast and alien for the human mind to comprehend. Then blackness. Back on the Resolute, on the bridge, Captain Harker stared at the radar screen. The William D. Porter, the impossible ship, was gone. Not sunk, not drifting, simply gone. The icebreaker shuddered as the storm around them broke apart, the aurora scattering like smoke. The sea was calm again, the horizon empty, but the comms crackled once more. "HX-229, hold the line, they are coming." And this time it wasn't just Mason's voice. It was layered, dozens of voices, American and German alike, whispering through the static. The Resolute's crew exchanged horrified glances, because among those voices, they swore they could hear their own names. The world went silent, not quiet, silent. No hum of the turbines, no whispers bleeding through the comms, no sound of the storm above, just silence. Mason opened his eyes, and for a long moment, he couldn't tell if he was still alive. The engine room was gone. The walls had dissolved into blackness, yet somehow he was still standing, still clutching the frozen Luger in his hand. The rest of the team floated around him, suspended in a void that felt both endless and suffocating. Ramirez's lips moved, but no sound came out. Collins screamed, but it was swallowed instantly, the silence eating it whole. Then, from the nothingness came light. Not the pale aurora glow they'd seen outside, not the icy blue-green shimmer of the sphere. This light was pure white, sharp and endless, like standing in the heart of a star. Shapes began to form inside it, ships, hundreds of them, stretching out across a sea that wasn't water but something else. The William D. Porter was no longer a single ghost. It was part of an entire fleet, the convoy, a fleet trapped in time. The team found themselves standing on the frozen deck once more, but the ship wasn't alone. All around them, half buried in ice, were the spectral forms of ships, Allied destroyers, merchant vessels, even the dark silhouettes of U-boats. Their hulls rose like tombstones from the frozen sea, suspended in impossible positions. Some were upside down, some broken in half, some glowing faintly with that same unearthly light. It was as though the entire convoy of 1943, every ship, every sailor, every submarine, had been ripped from time and trapped here, locked forever in the Arctic grave. Krause staggered to the rail, her breath catching in her throat. My God, it wasn't just the porter, the whole convoy, all of them. Jensen whispered, we're standing in the middle of it, a graveyard, but they're not dead. As if on cue, the frozen figures stirred again.
Across the ice, sailors in every kind of uniform began to move, their glowing eyes turning toward the modern intruders. The whispers came back, louder than ever. Join the fleet. The war is not over. The storm is the door. The pull of the rift. The air began to vibrate. Mason could feel it in his chest, like standing too close to artillery fire. The white light in the distance pulsed, and every ship in the convoy seemed to shift closer, dragged toward it by an unseen tide. The porter groaned, its hull grinding against the ice, as though being dragged into motion. The boarding team clung to the rails, their eyes darting to the impossible fleet. Novak was pale, his hands trembling over his ruined instruments. It's pulling everything back. The whole convoy is being sucked into the rift. They've been caught in this loop for decades, replaying the same battle over and over, feeding whatever's on the other side. Mason's jaw tightened. So what happens when we get pulled in? Novak met his eyes. Then we'll fight in that war, forever. A desperate plan. Mason gripped the frozen Luger tighter. His mind raced, searching for any option other than surrendering to this eternity. Kraus, he barked. You said it's feeding on the turbines. If we shut them down, it could collapse the rift. She finished, her voice steady. But if it collapses while we're inside, we're done, Mason said. Well, I know. But if it doesn't collapse, if that thing gets through, it's not just us, it's everyone. The team fell silent. Collins's eyes darted to the frozen figures surrounding them. Sir, they're not attacking now. Maybe they don't want us to stop it. As if hearing him, the glowing officer stepped forward again, his smile fixed. He raised his hand in a stiff, mechanical salute. The fleet sails forever. Mason felt a surge of rage. Not if I can help it. Into the core. They forced their way past the circle of frozen men. The whispers grew louder, piercing, clawing at their sanity. Mason felt as if his thoughts were being pulled out of his skull, like threads unraveling. The engine turbines roared, even though no fuel remained to power them. The sphere pulsed faster now, its surface rippling with light. The shadows on the other side pressed closer, their forms straining against the veil. Novak fell to his knees beside a control panel, pulling wires and yanking at levers. Sparks flew. The air smelled of burning metal. Cover me, he shouted. The team formed a perimeter, rifles aimed at the frozen sailors, but the figures no longer advanced. They simply watched, their whispers rising into a terrible harmony, a choir of the damned. Forever, forever, forever. Ramirez's voice shook. I can't take it anymore. It's in my head, sir. It's inside my head. Mason grabbed his shoulder, steadying him. Stay with me, soldier. We're not theirs. Not yet. The final surge. Novak's voice cracked through the roar. Almost there. One more surge, and it'll overload. The sphere pulsed violently, sending a wave of energy through the room. The lights on the porter exploded, plunging them into flickering shadows. The frozen figures convulsed, their mouths tearing open wider than human jaws should allow. The war is eternal. The convoy must sail. Mason raised the Luger again, his hand trembling. He aimed at the core of the sphere. On my mark, Novak shouted. 3, 2. The officer moved, faster than before. He lunged for Mason, ice shattering from his body in a spray of shards. Mason pulled the trigger. The Luger cracked, the bullet streaking into the heart of the sphere. The world turned white. The radar lit up with 100 signals at once, the entire Phantom convoy suddenly materializing on the scope. Impossible, one of the technicians muttered. They're everywhere. Through the icy mist, the shapes of ships appeared. Warships, transports, submarines, ghostly silhouettes, glowing faintly. And at the center of it all, the William D. Porter, its guns raised, its deck alive with figures both American and German. Captain Harker stared in disbelief. Dear God. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, the ships began to fade. One by one they dissolved into the aurora light, pulled into the rift. The Porter was the last to vanish, its hull folding into the void like paper, leaving only ripples across the calm Arctic Sea. The radar cleared. The storm dispersed. The ocean was empty once again, but the comms were not silent. The speakers hissed with static, then filled with voices. Dozens of them, hundreds, men shouting orders in English, in German, in something older and darker, and beneath it all, Mason's voice, clear, desperate, echoing across the decades. The war isn't over. Don't follow us. Don't open the door. The transmission ended. The crew of the Resolute stared at one another in stunned silence. No one spoke. No one moved. Outside, the Arctic night was quiet again, but every man on that bridge knew the truth. The William D. Porter hadn't just been found, it had been reclaimed. And somewhere beyond the rift, the convoy still sailed, locked in an endless war, fighting an enemy no one on Earth was meant to see.
The crew of the Resolute spent the next several hours in a silence broken only by the groan of shifting ice and the distant crackle of the northern wind. No one dared touch the radios again, though the static still whispered faintly, almost like breathing. Harker stood by the chart table, staring at the empty patch of sea where the phantom convoy had vanished. His knuckles were white against the edge of the table. He wanted to order the ship to move, to push through the ice and head south. But every time he opened his mouth, the words died on his tongue. It wasn't just fear, it was the nagging sense that they hadn't truly escaped. That the rift had only swallowed the Porter and her ghostly fleet for now, waiting for another chance to drag something else in. "Captain," Ensign Wallace said quietly, "what do we tell command?" Harker turned toward the young officer. The boy's face was pale, eyes still darting to the radio, as if expecting Mason's voice to return at any second. "We tell them the truth," Harker said. His voice was hoarse. "We saw a ship that shouldn't exist. We sent men aboard, and now the ship's gone, and so are they." But even as he spoke, he knew those words would never reach anyone who mattered. The silence breaks again. It was nearly dawn when the static returned. Louder this time, filled with voices overlapping in a chaos of tongues. German, English, Russian, even fragments of what sounded like Inuit chants. The voices spoke in unison. "We sail, we fight, we are not done. The ice remembers, the storm remembers." The radio operator ripped his headset off, shaking his head violently. "It's them, sir. It's all of them." And then, cutting through the storm of voices, came a sound that froze every man on the bridge. Wallace, Harker, Ramirez. The names were theirs, spoken in their own voices. The crew recoiled. "That was me," Wallace whispered, his face drained of color. "That was my voice." Another voice followed, hoarse, broken, but unmistakable. "Mason, don't come for us. Don't follow. The door must stay closed." The channel went dead. By the time the Resolute limped back to port, battered and shaken, the official version of events had already been written. The storm had forced the mission to abort. The boarding team was lost in an accident. No mention of the William D. Porter. No mention of the convoy. Certainly no mention of a glowing rift at the bottom of the Arctic. The families of the missing men received folded flags and carefully worded condolences. "Killed in the line of duty." No details offered, no questions answered, but among the crew of the Resolute, whispers spread. Men spoke of hearing their own voices on the radio, of seeing flashes of impossible ships in the fog on their return journey. Some claimed they heard footsteps echoing through the empty corridors at night, boots striking steel that wasn't there. A few refused to speak at all. They stared out at the sea, hollow-eyed, as if listening for something only they could hear. Stories in the snow. Weeks later, a team of Russian ice fishermen reported seeing something strange on the edge of the pack ice. A ship, they said, blackened and ancient, its hull rising from the ice like the bones of a whale. They swore they saw men standing on the deck, motionless, their eyes glowing faintly in the Arctic dawn. When one of the fishermen raised binoculars, he claimed he saw modern uniforms among them, American camouflage, frostbitten and rigid, mouths moving in unison with the others. The war is not over, the convoy sails. By the time an icebreaker was dispatched to investigate, the ship was gone. All that remained was a wide scar in the ice, as if something massive had slid beneath the surface. The hidden files. Back in Washington, Harker sat in a dimly lit room, a stack of sealed folders on the desk in front of him. Each folder was marked with red ink, classified, eyes only. A stern-faced officer slid one across the table. "Sign." Harker stared at the paper. He could feel Mason's voice echoing in the back of his mind. The desperate plea, "Don't open the door." "Captain," the officer said, his tone sharp. "For the record, you encountered severe weather. Your boarding team was lost in the storm. That's all you know. That's all you will ever say. Do you understand?" Harker hesitated. Then, slowly, he signed. As he set the pen down, he realized he had just sealed more than a document. He had sealed the fate of 30 men, erased them from history as surely as the rift had erased the porter. Echoes in the ice. Months passed. The Arctic thawed, froze again, and thawed once more. The world moved on, forgetting the vanished convoy. But in the dead of winter, fishermen whispered of strange lights dancing on the horizon, brighter than any aurora. Submariners spoke of radar ghosts, entire fleets appearing and vanishing in an instant. And sometimes, late at night, sailors swore they could hear voices carried on the icy wind. Not just German, not just English, but their own voices, calling out from the darkness, "Hold the line, we are waiting, the war is eternal." Some said the Arctic itself had become a grave. Others whispered that it had become something worse, a prison, not for the dead, but for those trapped in a war that time refused to let end. And somewhere, deep beneath the ice, the William D. Porter and her ghostly convoy sailed on, locked in an endless loop of fire and shadow. The war that never ended, the reports never stopped. By spring, the Resolute's logs had been rewritten, the official story sealed away in Pentagon vaults. The families of the missing men were told their sons, brothers and fathers were lost to an Arctic storm. No mention of the convoy, no mention of the rift, no mention of the whispers. But Harker knew better. He hadn't slept a full night since. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard Mason's voice. Not just once, not just an echo of memory, but present, urgent. "We're still here. Don't follow us. Don't let them through." At first he told himself it was guilt, the mind replaying trauma, inventing ghosts where there were none. But then came the proof, the recording. Weeks later, a technician from the Resolute found something buried in the ship's black box archives. A corrupted audio log, time-stamped at the exact moment the porter vanished. Harker and Krauss listened to it in a windowless room. The recording was a storm of static, but beneath it, the voices were clear. "Eagle 1, this is Sentry 2. Contact front. Hold the line, hold the line. Mein Gott, it's huge. Feuer, Feuer. Jensen, get back." And then Mason again, his voice cracking with desperation. "If you hear us, it means the door is still open." The file ended with a sound unlike anything either of them had ever heard. Not gunfire, not explosion, not storm. A low resonant howl that seemed to stretch forever, rattling their teeth even through the recording. Krauss turned to Harker, her face pale. "They're not gone, Captain. They're still in there, fighting, over and over. The cover-up." The higher-ups acted swiftly. The recording was confiscated. The technician who found it was reassigned within days to a classified post in Alaska and was never heard from again. Harker was ordered to stand down. "This goes no further," the Admiral told him, his voice cold. "Do you understand? No more reports, no more talk. If anyone asks, you never saw the porter, you never lost that team. The Arctic is classified airspace, understood." But silence didn't stop the truth. Sailors whispered in bars about phantom ships cutting across the radar. A Russian icebreaker crew swore they saw a massive silhouette trailing them for miles beneath the waves. A Norwegian fishing village reported hearing machine gun fire under the ice. And then came the disappearances, the vanishing patrols. In early winter, a Canadian reconnaissance team vanished during a routine patrol along the Arctic Circle. No distress call, no trace. Only their snowmobiles were found, engines running, headlights cutting through the fog, seats empty. A month later, a Norwegian patrol reported seeing a group of men marching single file across the ice. They assumed it was the missing Canadians until they got closer. The men's uniforms were tattered, their rifles rusted, their faces locked in expressions of silent horror. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark. "Join us, the war is eternal." When the Norwegians approached, the figures dissolved into the fog. Mason's last message. It was January 2024 when Harker finally received a call he had been both dreading and waiting for. A private line, no caller ID. He answered cautiously. "Mason," he whispered. There was a long silence, then static, and then his voice, broken, distorted, but unmistakably real. "Captain, you shouldn't have signed it. You shouldn't have sealed the truth. We're still here, fighting. Every night, every storm, the convoy sails, and the shadows keep coming. They want out. They won't stop. Mason, where are you? Tell me where." Harker demanded, his voice trembling, but the reply was not what he expected. "Look to the ice. Look to your own reflection. We're already behind you." The line went dead. The final encounter.
2 weeks later, the Resolute was ordered back north. Officially, the mission was a supply run. Unofficially, Harker knew what it was. Command was sending them back to the site, back to where the convoy had vanished. The crew was silent as they broke through the ice. No jokes, no laughter, just the hum of the engines and the groan of the frozen sea. Then, one night, the aurora appeared again, brighter than ever, spilling across the sky in violent green and violet flames. The radar lit up. The convoy was back. Harker gripped the rail, his breath fogging in the frigid air. All hands, battle stations. But there was no battle, no torpedoes, no enemy fire, just the silent silhouettes of ships rising from the ice like ghosts. And then they saw them, figures moving across the decks, some in tattered US Navy uniforms, others in ragged German coats, and among them, modern shapes, the missing boarding team. Mason stood at the bow of the Porter, his eyes glowing faintly in the aurora light. He raised his rifle in salute, his mouth moving in perfect unison with the rest of the frozen convoy. The war is eternal. The convoy sails forever. The last log. When the Resolute finally returned to port weeks later, there was no crew aboard, no captain, no sailors, no explanation. The ship was found adrift, its engines still running, its decks eerily empty. In the radio room, investigators discovered a single recording, time-stamped on the night of January 23, 2024. The tape was short, only 40 seconds long. It began with static, then the sound of waves and distant gunfire. Dozens of voices rose in a chant, growing louder, filling the speakers with a harmony of English, German, Russian, and something far older. The war is eternal. The storm is the door. The convoy sails forever. And then, clear above them all, came Captain Harker's voice, message to command. We've sighted them again. The Porter, the convoy, and Mason. He's with them. They're calling to us. They want us to follow. God help us. The tape ended with the same low howl the Resolute had recorded months earlier. The official report declared the crew of the Resolute missing, presumed lost in Arctic waters. The recording was buried with the rest of the classified files. The legend grows, but legends have a way of slipping through cracks, just like the rift in the ice. Fishermen, explorers, and satellite operators continue to report fleeting glimpses of ships on the Arctic horizon. Ghostly convoys, sometimes visible under the aurora, sometimes flickering on radar for mere seconds before vanishing, and always, without fail, the same chilling whisper carried on the polar wind. The war is eternal. The convoy sails forever. Even now, some sailors claim that if you tune a radio to just the right frequency on a stormy night in the Arctic, you can hear them. The clash of guns, the screams of men, the roar of something vast and hungry pressing against the veil of reality. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you'll hear a new voice added to the chorus. A voice that shouldn't be there. A voice from a ship that should never have been lost in 19... This is Mason. The fight goes on. The door must stay closed. The recording fades, but the whispers never end. Because somewhere, out there in the endless ice, the Arctic ghost convoy sails on, trapped in time, locked in battle, fighting an enemy that is not of this world. And maybe, just maybe, they're waiting for reinforcements.
Don't forget to subscribe for more mysterious stories. Don't forget to subscribe for more mysterious stories.